You are lying awake at 2 in the morning. The room is silent, your phone screen is dark. There is nobody to impress, nobody to argue with, nobody watching. For a moment, all the noise disappears. The opinions, the traditions, the certainty, the fear. And then a thought enters your mind that feels strangely dangerous. Not because it is evil, not because it is rebellious, but because you realize you do not actually know how to answer it. You have heard thousands of answers. You have heard debates, sermons, books, speeches, podcasts, experts, skeptics, believers, critics, philosophers, and ordinary people all try to address it. Yet somehow the question remains standing, untouched, unmoved, waiting. And the uncomfortable part is not that nobody has answered it. The uncomfortable part is that perhaps nobody can. Perhaps the reason this question survives generation after generation is because it exposes something deeper than religion, deeper than philosophy, deeper than science, deeper than ideology. Perhaps it exposes something about us, about the human mind itself. Because the moment this question appears, something fascinating happens. People stop exploring and start defending. They stop investigating and start protecting. It is as if the question accidentally touched a wire hidden inside the human psyche. A wire connected to identity, belonging, meaning, purpose, fear, hope, and survival itself. And once that wire is touched, objectivity becomes almost impossible. Maybe you have experienced this yourself. Maybe you were talking with friends. Maybe you were watching a video. Maybe you were reading a comment section. Maybe someone asked a question that seemed innocent at first. But within seconds, the atmosphere changed. People became emotional, defensive, frustrated, passionate. Suddenly, nobody was examining the question anymore. Everyone was protecting something. Protecting a worldview, protecting a belief, protecting an identity, protecting a sense of certainty. And that is where this becomes deeply personal. Because what if the hardest questions are not difficult because they lack answers? What if they are difficult because the answers threaten something we need emotionally? Think about how often human beings confuse comfort with truth. Think about how often we reject information not because it is false, but because it is painful. Think about how often we accept ideas not because they are proven, but because they help us sleep at night. This is not criticism. This is observation. Every human being does it. Every single one. Including the people who claim they never do. Especially the people who claim they never do. If this question has ever crossed your mind, or if you have ever found yourself secretly struggling with something you felt you were not supposed to question, leave your perspective below. Not because there is a right answer waiting to be discovered in the comments, but because the experience itself is more common than most people admit. The strange thing is that children seem to understand this better than adults. A child can ask a question that instantly makes a room uncomfortable. Not because the child is trying to be provocative, not because the child has an agenda, but because children have not yet learned which questions are dangerous. They have not yet learned which topics are protected. They have not yet learned which assumptions everyone silently agrees not to challenge. And sometimes a simple question from a child can expose a contradiction that dozens of intelligent adults have spent years ignoring. Then something changes. We grow older, we become part of groups, we develop identities, we adopt narratives, we build psychological homes inside certain ideas. And once we begin living inside those ideas, questioning them starts to feel like questioning ourselves. This is where the real conflict begins, because most people believe they are searching for truth, but often they are searching for stability. They are searching for emotional ground beneath their feet. They are searching for something solid in a world that constantly changes. There is nothing wrong with that. In fact, it may be one of the most human desires imaginable. The problem appears when the desire for certainty becomes stronger than the desire to understand. Because then every question becomes a threat. Every doubt becomes an enemy. Every contradiction becomes something that must be explained away rather than explored. And yet the question remains, quietly waiting, unanswered, or perhaps unanswerable. Imagine two people standing at the edge of the same mystery. One looks into the darkness and says the answer must be this. The other looks into the same darkness and says the answer must be that. They argue for years. They gather evidence. They build arguments. They attack each other's conclusions, but neither notices the deeper reality. Neither actually knows what is hidden in the darkness. Both are interpreting, both are constructing meaning, both are filling gaps. And suddenly the conflict is no longer about discovering what is true. It becomes about defending what feels necessary. This pattern appears everywhere, not just in religion, not just in philosophy, in politics, relationships, careers, families, personal identities. People often become emotionally attached to conclusions long before they become intellectually convinced of them. Then, they spend years collecting evidence afterward. Think about the last time you changed your mind about something important. Not a small preference, not a favorite movie. Something significant, something connected to who you are. It probably was not a pleasant experience. It probably felt like losing something. Because every major realization requires a small death. The death of an old certainty. The death of an old identity. The death of an old story. And human beings resist those deaths with remarkable determination. Which brings us back to the question, the one nobody seems able to answer in a way that satisfies everyone. Perhaps the reason it survives is because it reveals the limits of human certainty itself. We want final answers. We crave them. We build civilizations around them. We write books about them. We fight wars over them. We organize communities around them. Yet reality repeatedly reminds us that certainty is often more fragile than we imagine. Consider how many things previous generations believed with complete confidence. Ideas that felt obvious. Ideas that seemed unquestionable. Ideas that entire societies treated as absolute truth. Many of those ideas eventually collapsed, not because people were stupid, not because they were evil, but because human beings are remarkably capable of being convinced they understand more than they actually do. That realization should be humbling, deeply humbling, because it raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if some of our strongest convictions today will look equally fragile to future generations? What if the question that nobody can answer is not exposing a weakness in one particular belief system? What if it is exposing a weakness built into human perception itself? What if we are all standing inside a reality far more mysterious than we are comfortable admitting? Most people say they are comfortable with uncertainty. Very few actually are. Watch what happens when uncertainty enters someone's life. A diagnosis, a loss, a betrayal, a financial collapse, a personal crisis. Suddenly, certainty becomes incredibly valuable. The mind begins searching desperately for explanations, for patterns, for meaning, for reasons. Not necessarily because the explanations are correct, but because uncertainty is psychologically exhausting. Human beings can tolerate pain surprisingly well. What they struggle to tolerate is not knowing why the pain exists. This may be one of the deepest truths about our species. We are meaning-making creatures. We would often rather have a painful explanation than no explanation at all. We would rather have a terrifying story than a blank page. Because a story at least provides structure. A story provides orientation. A story tells us where we stand. But what happens when the story itself becomes uncertain? What happens when the foundations begin shaking? What happens when the question refuses to disappear no matter how many answers are offered? That is where the real journey begins. Not the journey toward certainty, the journey toward intellectual honesty. And intellectual honesty is far more uncomfortable than most people realize. It requires the courage to admit when we do not know. It requires the courage to sit with questions that may never be fully resolved. It requires the courage to resist easy answers when reality appears more complicated than we would like. Somewhere in your life there is probably a question like this. A question you have never completely answered. A question you occasionally push aside because it creates tension. A question that returns during quiet moments when distractions disappear. Maybe it concerns meaning. Maybe it concerns suffering. Maybe it concerns purpose. Maybe it concerns existence itself. Whatever form it takes, the experience is surprisingly universal. People rarely talk about it openly because uncertainty can feel lonely. But beneath the surface, countless individuals are wrestling with the same unresolved mysteries. And here is something even more unsettling. The question may not be important because of the answer. The question may be important because of what it reveals about the person asking it, the fears it exposes, the assumptions it challenges, the emotional investments it uncovers, the hidden motivations it brings into the light. If you disagree with that, explain why below, because this is where the conversation becomes truly interesting, not when people repeat familiar conclusions, but when they explore why certain conclusions feel necessary in the first place. And perhaps that is why this question continues surviving every generation. Not because humanity lacks intelligence, not because humanity lacks information, but because the question forces us to confront something far more difficult than ignorance. It forces us to confront ourselves, and what happens next may be the part nobody expects. Because the deeper you investigate this mystery, the less it becomes about finding an answer out there somewhere in the world, and the more it becomes about understanding the hidden forces inside your own mind that shape what you are willing to accept, reject, believe, doubt, fear, and defend. The uncomfortable realization waiting ahead is not simply about the question. It is about why the question affects people so deeply in the first place. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to look at certainty the same way again. There is a moment that almost everyone experiences, although few people talk about it honestly. It usually happens quietly. No dramatic music, no life-changing speech, no lightning strike of revelation. It happens when you encounter information, an experience, a loss, a contradiction, or a realization that does not fit inside the story you have been telling yourself. At first, you ignore it. Most people do. The mind is remarkably skilled at protecting itself from discomfort. You tell yourself it is not important. You tell yourself there must be an explanation. You tell yourself you will think about it later. But later comes, and the contradiction is still there. Then something strange begins to happen. You find yourself returning to it, not because you want to, because you cannot stop. The question keeps resurfacing. During a drive, while taking a shower, lying awake at night, looking out a window, watching other people live their lives. It appears without invitation, and every time it returns, it carries the same unsettling message. Something does not fit. Something is unresolved. Something you thought was solid may not be as solid as you believed. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume the discomfort means they are moving in the wrong direction. They assume uncertainty is a sign of failure. They assume doubt is evidence that something has gone wrong. But what if the opposite is true? What if discomfort is sometimes evidence that something is finally becoming visible? Think back to moments when you matured emotionally, truly matured, not simply growing older, becoming wiser, becoming more self-aware. Those moments rarely felt pleasant. In fact, many of them probably felt devastating. You discovered that someone you admired was flawed. You realized a relationship was unhealthy. You understood that a dream you had chased for years would never make you happy. You recognized patterns within yourself that you had spent years denying. None of those realizations felt good, yet many of them became turning points. This creates a fascinating paradox. The human mind seeks truth, but often resists the emotional consequences of finding it. We want reality, but only if reality agrees with us. We want understanding, but only if understanding leaves our existing worldview intact. The moment reality demands change, resistance begins. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer intellectual. It becomes emotional, deeply emotional. Imagine a person standing in front of a mirror that reveals not their appearance, but their beliefs. Every assumption, every certainty, every hidden fear, every unconscious motivation, every contradiction. How long could they look? How long could any of us look? Because that is what certain questions actually do. They act like mirrors. They reveal things that were already present but hidden beneath the surface. And that may explain why some questions generate such powerful reactions. The reaction is not necessarily about the question itself. It is about what the question exposes. Consider how often people defend positions they have never seriously examined. They inherit ideas from family, culture, environment, community, education, experience, and repetition. Eventually, those ideas stop feeling like beliefs and start feeling like reality itself. Then one day someone asks a simple question. Not an attack, not an accusation, just a question. Suddenly emotions emerge that seem wildly disproportionate: anger, fear, anxiety, defensiveness. Why? Because the question accidentally touched something much larger than an idea. It touched identity. Identity is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Most people underestimate how much of their thinking is connected to their need for belonging. Human beings are social creatures. For thousands of years, survival depended on remaining part of a group. Being excluded could mean death. Perhaps traces of that ancient reality still live within us. Perhaps that is why questioning certain assumptions can feel emotionally dangerous, even when no physical threat exists. Somewhere deep inside, the mind may interpret uncertainty as risk, not intellectual risk, social risk, emotional risk, existential risk. This becomes especially visible when people encounter perspectives that challenge their own. Notice how rarely conversations stay focused on ideas. Instead, they often become battles of identity. One side feels attacked, the other side feels misunderstood. Both become increasingly certain. Yet certainty does not necessarily mean understanding has increased. Sometimes certainty simply means fear has intensified. If you have ever experienced that tension yourself, if you have ever felt torn between what you genuinely think and what you feel expected to think, share that experience below. You may discover that far more people understand that struggle than you realize. The truth is that many individuals spend years living between two worlds: the world of questions and the world of certainty, the world of curiosity and the world of belonging, the world of exploration and the world of comfort. Neither side is completely satisfying. Endless uncertainty can feel exhausting. Absolute certainty can become suffocating. So people drift between them, searching for balance, searching for a place where honesty and stability can coexist. Sometimes they find it, sometimes they do not. And this brings us closer to the heart of the mystery. Because the question nobody seems able to answer perfectly may be exposing a limitation that extends beyond any specific topic. It may be revealing that human beings are not neutral observers of reality. We never have been. We interpret, we filter, we construct narratives, we assign meaning. We are not cameras recording existence exactly as it is. We are storytellers attempting to make sense of something far larger than ourselves. That realization can feel unsettling at first, but it can also be liberating because it removes a burden many people secretly carry. The burden of pretending certainty where certainty does not exist. Think about how much energy people spend maintaining appearances, appearing confident, appearing knowledgeable, appearing certain, appearing in control. Yet beneath the surface, many are wrestling with unanswered questions. Many are navigating ambiguities they rarely discuss. Many are carrying doubts they feel ashamed to admit. The irony is that uncertainty may be far more universal than certainty. We simply hide it better. There is another reason this question refuses to disappear. It touches one of humanity's deepest fears, not the fear of being wrong, the fear of meaninglessness. Because whenever fundamental questions arise, another possibility quietly emerges behind them. What if there is no simple explanation? What if reality is more mysterious than we expected? What if the answers we seek are more complicated than the human mind prefers? Those possibilities can feel threatening because meaning is not merely an intellectual preference. Meaning is psychological oxygen. It influences motivation, resilience, hope, purpose, and identity. Without meaning, suffering becomes much harder to endure. Without meaning, sacrifice feels pointless. Without meaning, uncertainty becomes overwhelming. This is why people fight so fiercely over explanations. They are often fighting for more than ideas. They are fighting for significance. They are fighting for coherence. They are fighting for a framework that allows life to make sense. Yet something remarkable happens when a person becomes comfortable admitting uncertainty. Their relationship with questions begins to change. Instead of seeing questions as enemies, they begin seeing them as invitations. Instead of demanding immediate answers, they become willing to explore. Instead of protecting conclusions, they become interested in understanding why those conclusions emerged in the first place. This shift is subtle but profound. It transforms the entire experience. Suddenly, the goal is no longer to win. The goal is to learn. The goal is not to eliminate mystery. The goal is to engage with it honestly. And perhaps that is where many discussions go wrong. People enter them expecting resolution when what they actually need is reflection. They expect certainty when what they may need is humility. They expect finality when reality may be offering complexity instead. Look around at the world. Notice how often the loudest voices project the greatest certainty. Then ask yourself whether certainty and wisdom are always the same thing. History suggests otherwise. Some of the wisest individuals who ever lived spoke frequently about the limits of their knowledge. They understood something many people forget. Awareness of ignorance is not weakness. It is awareness. Pretending to know what you do not know may feel stronger in the moment, but it often creates deeper confusion later. There is an uncomfortable freedom hidden inside that realization. The freedom to stop performing certainty. The freedom to stop defending every assumption. The freedom to acknowledge complexity without feeling defeated by it. And yet the mystery remains. The question remains, standing exactly where it was before, unresolved, persistent, refusing to disappear. But now it looks different, because perhaps the most important discovery is not hidden inside the answer. Perhaps it is hidden inside the search itself. Perhaps what makes this question so powerful is that it reveals how human beings respond when certainty begins to crack. Some become defensive, some become curious, some become fearful, some become reflective, some become more compassionate, some become more rigid. The question functions almost like a psychological stress test. It reveals what lies beneath the surface. And what it reveals next may be even more unsettling, because the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to separate the question from the person asking it. Eventually, you begin noticing something that changes everything. Different people hear the exact same question and experience completely different emotional reactions. And those reactions may reveal far more than the answers they eventually choose. The reason for that difference leads directly into the realization most people never see coming. The realization that transforms the entire mystery from a debate about answers into an examination of the hidden architecture of the human mind itself. Imagine two people sitting in the same room hearing the exact same question. The words are identical. The meaning is identical. Nothing has changed. Yet one person feels curiosity while the other feels threatened. One feels excitement while the other feels anxiety. One leans forward while the other immediately begins constructing a defense. Why? If the question itself is the same, then the difference must exist somewhere else. And that realization may be the most important part of this entire journey, because eventually you begin noticing that questions do not simply interact with ideas. They interact with wounds, they interact with fears, they interact with hopes, they interact with memories, they interact with experiences that have nothing to do with logic and everything to do with being human. Think about how often a person's life story shapes the way they interpret reality. Someone who experienced betrayal may see trust differently. Someone who experienced loss may see suffering differently. Someone who experienced rejection may see belonging differently. Someone who experienced profound meaning may see purpose differently. We like to imagine that our conclusions emerge from pure reason, but human beings are rarely that simple. Our minds are not laboratories. They are landscapes. Landscapes filled with memories, emotions, victories, regrets, disappointments, attachments, fears, and desires. Every new question must travel through that landscape before it becomes an opinion. That is why two intelligent people can examine the same evidence and arrive somewhere completely different. Not necessarily because one is honest and the other dishonest. Not necessarily because one is rational and the other irrational. Sometimes they are simply standing on different emotional terrain. And once you begin seeing that, something remarkable happens. You stop viewing disagreement as proof that someone is foolish. You begin recognizing how deeply personal belief can be. You begin recognizing that behind many convictions is a story. Behind many stories is a wound. Behind many wounds is a fear. And behind many fears is a human being trying to make sense of existence just like everyone else. This does not mean all ideas are equally correct. It does not mean every conclusion is equally supported. It means understanding people requires more than analyzing their arguments. It requires understanding the invisible forces shaping those arguments. The reason nobody has ever given a universally satisfying answer to this question may be because people are not actually asking the same thing when they hear it. On the surface, they are. Beneath the surface, they are not. One person is asking whether life has meaning. Another is asking whether suffering has purpose. Another is asking whether uncertainty can be tolerated. Another is asking whether their deepest hopes are justified. Another is asking whether their fears are true. The words may be identical, but the emotional questions hidden beneath them are often completely different. That changes everything. Because suddenly, the search for an answer becomes far less about solving a puzzle and far more about understanding the person searching for the solution. Consider a moment from your own life, a moment when you desperately wanted an answer, not an abstract answer, a real answer. Maybe after heartbreak, maybe after loss, maybe after disappointment, maybe after watching something you believed collapse in front of you. During those moments, were you searching only for information, or were you searching for reassurance? Were you searching for facts, or were you searching for stability? Most people discover it was both. Human beings rarely seek answers for purely intellectual reasons. They seek answers because answers affect how they live, how they suffer, how they hope, how they move forward. This is why some questions carry so much emotional weight. They are connected to life itself. Yet there is another layer hidden beneath all of this, a layer that many people never reach because it requires letting go of something incredibly difficult, the need for complete certainty. Somewhere along the way, many of us were taught that uncertainty is failure, that not knowing is weakness, that confidence is always superior to doubt. But reality often tells a different story. Some of the most destructive decisions in human history were made by people absolutely convinced they were right. Some of the greatest discoveries emerged because someone was willing to admit they might be wrong. Humility rarely receives the same admiration as certainty. Yet humility may be one of the most powerful intellectual tools ever developed, not because it guarantees truth, because it keeps the search alive. The moment a person becomes incapable of questioning themselves, growth begins to slow. Curiosity begins to shrink. Possibility begins to disappear. Perhaps that is why the question survives, not because it has defeated humanity, because it protects humanity from premature certainty. It reminds us that reality may be larger than our explanations. It reminds us that complexity may exceed our categories. It reminds us that mystery is not always an enemy. Sometimes mystery is simply the recognition that existence contains depths we have not yet reached. There is a story that plays out in countless lives. A person spends years believing they must eventually arrive at perfect certainty. They imagine that one day every doubt will vanish, every contradiction will disappear, every question will be resolved. Then life happens. More experiences arrive, more perspectives emerge, more complexity reveals itself. And gradually they realize something unexpected. Wisdom may not be the absence of questions. Wisdom may be learning how to live honestly alongside them. That realization changes the relationship entirely. Suddenly, uncertainty stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like part of the human experience. Curiosity becomes possible again. Exploration becomes possible again. Dialogue becomes possible again. Because there is no longer a desperate need to force reality into simple conclusions. And perhaps that is why the strongest reactions often come from people who feel they must defend certainty at all costs. If certainty becomes part of identity, questioning feels dangerous. But if identity is rooted in honesty, then questions become opportunities rather than threats. If you have ever reached a point where you became more interested in understanding than simply being right, share that experience below. Those moments often become turning points in a person's life, even when they are uncomfortable. Because the truth is that many people spend years trying to win arguments they secretly lost long ago in private moments of reflection. They continue defending positions externally while wrestling internally with questions they cannot ignore. Eventually, the tension becomes exhausting, and that exhaustion often leads to one of the most transformative realizations a person can experience. The realization that being human means living with limits. Limits of perception, limits of knowledge, limits of certainty, limits of understanding. At first this sounds disappointing. It sounds like surrender. But for many people it becomes liberation. Because once you accept those limits, you stop carrying impossible expectations. You stop demanding perfect answers to every mystery. You stop expecting complete certainty from an incomplete perspective. You begin approaching reality with a mixture of confidence and humility, conviction and curiosity, belief and openness. And suddenly the question that nobody has ever answered perfectly reveals its final gift. It was never simply testing intelligence. It was testing character. It was revealing how we respond when certainty becomes impossible. Do we become hostile, defensive, arrogant, closed, or do we become thoughtful, curious, humble, reflective? The answer to that may matter more than the answer to the question itself, because long after specific arguments fade, long after debates are forgotten, long after theories change and perspectives evolve, one thing remains: the kind of person we become while searching, and perhaps that is the uncomfortable truth hidden beneath the entire mystery. The question survives not because humanity has failed to answer it, but because the question continues, revealing something essential about what it means to be human. It reveals our longing for meaning, our fear of uncertainty, our desire for belonging, our struggle with doubt, our attachment to stories, our search for purpose, our need to feel that life makes sense. The reason nobody has ever given a good answer that satisfies everyone may be because no answer could ever be larger than the human condition itself. The question endures because it is woven into who we are, and maybe, just maybe, the moment you stop demanding a final answer is the moment you begin understanding why the question has survived for so long. Not as a problem waiting to be solved, but as a mirror patiently reflecting back the deepest parts of ourselves.